autumn of 1890 brought to London a fog so dense and persistent that it seemed to muffle not only the sounds of the great city, but the very spirits of its inhabitants. From our lodgings at Baker Street, I observed how the yellow murk clung to the windows with an almost malevolent persistence, transforming the familiar thoroughfare below into something alien and forbidding. It was during this oppressive season that there came to Sherlock Holmes a case so singular in its melancholy nature that I have long hesitated to set it down upon paper. The affair, which the press would later sensationalize as the Weeping Murders, began on a morning when my friend's restless energy seemed barely contained within the confines of our sitting-room. I had returned from St. Bartholomew's Hospital after attending to a young patient, my spirits somewhat dampened by the dreary weather and the child's persistent cough. Holmes lay sprawled upon the sofa in that peculiar state of languid contemplation which I had learned to recognize as the prelude to intense mental activity. The room bore the telltale signs of his recent chemical experiments, with various apparatus scattered across the table and a faint acidic odor lingering in the air. He did not acknowledge my entrance immediately, his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling, as though reading some invisible text written in the plaster above. "You have been treating a child this morning, Watson," he remarked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet with startling abruptness. "A girl of perhaps 7 years who suffers from a persistent cough. The mother is of the working class, but maintains standards of cleanliness that speak well of her character. You prescribed a simple remedy and accepted no payment." I lowered myself into my chair and regarded him with that mixture of astonishment and amusement his deductions invariably provoked. "Really, Holmes, your methods continue to astound me. Have you taken to following me about the city?" A thin smile crossed his aquiline features. "Nothing so dramatic, I assure you. You have a small handprint upon your left trouser leg, approximately at knee height, rendered in what appears to be coal dust. The size and position suggest a child who clutched at you while coughing, hence the dust from her clothes transferred to yours. Your medical bag shows signs of recent use, and I observe a bottle of your standard cough mixture is missing from its usual position. As for the matter of payment, your wallet remains as thin as yesterday, yet you display none of the satisfaction that accompanies profitable work." "Elementary, my dear fellow." Before I could respond, a sharp rap upon the door interrupted our exchange. Mrs. Hudson appeared, her face bearing an expression of concern. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's an Inspector Lestrade here to see you. He says it's most urgent and appears quite distressed." Holmes sprang upright with fluid grace, the lethargy vanishing from his demeanour as though it had never existed. "Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. The game, Watson, may finally be afoot." Inspector Lestrade entered our rooms with the harried appearance of a man who had not slept properly in days. His usually neat appearance was dishevelled, his collar askew, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He barely acknowledged my presence before addressing Holmes with an urgency that bordered on desperation. "Mr. Holmes, I come to you because this business has baffled everyone at the Yard. We have 3 bodies, 3 separate deaths across London in the past fortnight, and the only connection between them is something so peculiar that my superiors question my sanity." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with fierce intelligence. "Pray continue, Inspector. You know I have little patience for preambles when a genuine mystery presents itself." Lestrade withdrew a handkerchief and wiped his brow despite the coolness of the room. "Each victim, Mr. Holmes, was found dead under circumstances that defy explanation. No wounds, no signs of struggle, no evidence of poison that our chemists can detect. The medical men return verdicts of heart failure, yet these were healthy individuals with no history of cardiac weakness. The first was a prosperous merchant in his locked study, the second a music hall performer in her dressing room, the third a shipping clerk found at his desk after hours. Different ages, different circumstances, different parts of London. "Yet you speak of a connection," Holmes prompted, settling back in his chair with the air of a man prepared to savour every detail. "Indeed, and it is this that haunts me, sir. Upon the left cheek of each corpse we discovered a single tear. Not their own tears, mind you, for the ducts were dry and the eyes staring. This tear appears to have been placed there deliberately, and our analysis confirms it is human in origin, though whose we cannot determine. It glistens upon the cold flesh like some grotesque calling card, as if the killer mourns for his victims even as he destroys them." The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. Holmes rose and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed into the fog-shrouded street below. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of satisfaction I recognized all too well. A killer who weeps for his victims, or wishes us to believe he does. How perfectly theatrical, and yet how deeply disturbing. "Inspector, I believe this case may prove worthy of our most serious attention. And the combination of an impossible method and such a singular signature suggests we are dealing with no ordinary criminal mind." Holmes turned from the window with that decisive movement I had learned to recognize as the signal of his complete engagement with a problem. The languid contemplation had vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp focus of a mind presented with a puzzle worthy of its considerable powers. He gestured toward the chair opposite his own, and Lestrade sank into it with visible relief, as though the mere act of sharing his burden had already lightened the weight upon his shoulders. "You will have my complete attention, Inspector," Holmes declared, resuming his seat and pressing his fingertips together in that characteristic manner. "But I must insist upon absolute precision in your account. You mentioned 3 victims across a fortnight. I require exact dates, times of discovery, and the complete circumstances surrounding each death. Begin with the first, if you please, and omit no detail, however trivial it may appear to your trained eye." I reached for my notebook, knowing from long experience that Holmes would expect a complete record of the facts as they were presented. Lestrade extracted a worn leather notebook from his coat pocket and consulted it with the weary air of a man who had reviewed these same facts countless times without finding illumination. The first was Mr. Edmund Carstairs, aged 43, a wholesale merchant dealing primarily in Oriental silks and fine textiles. Lestrade began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of an official report. "He was discovered on the morning of October the 15th by his manservant, who had brought the customary morning tea to his study. The door was locked from within, the key still in the lock on the interior side. Carstairs was found slumped over his writing desk, quite dead, with that accursed tear glistening upon his left cheek." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes never leaving Lestrade's face. "The room showed no signs of disturbance, no evidence of struggle or forced entry?" "None whatsoever, Mr. Holmes. We examined every inch of that study with the most careful attention. The window was latched from inside, the chimney far too narrow for human passage, and the walls solid brick with no concealed openings. It was as though the man simply ceased to live, and someone materialized beside him long enough to place that tear before vanishing into the very air." Holmes made a dismissive gesture with one long, pale hand. "I have little patience for supernatural explanations, Inspector. They are invariably the refuge of minds too lazy to pursue the logical thread to its conclusion. What of Carstairs' personal circumstances? Had he enemies, financial difficulties, romantic entanglements that might have turned sour?" Lestrade consulted his notes once more. By all accounts, a respected gentleman of steady habits and sound business practices. His trade was prosperous, his marriage stable if not passionate, and we could uncover no suggestion of scandal or serious conflict. His physician, Dr. Henley of Harley Street, confirmed he was in excellent health, having examined him thoroughly but 3 weeks prior for his annual assessment. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, making a note upon the margin of his morning paper. "And the second victim?" "Miss Constance Hartley, aged 26, a singer of modest talent who performed under the stage name of Clara Vane at the Empire Theatre in Leicester Square. She was discovered on the evening of October the 21st, 6 days after Carstairs, seated in her dressing room between the first and second performances. The callboy had knocked twice at her door without receiving an answer. When the stage manager forced entry, fearing she had taken ill, they found her before her mirror in full costume, head tilted slightly as though listening for distant applause. Quite dead, with that same mysterious tear upon her cheek. Holmes rose and began to pace slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. The theatre would have been bustling with performers and stagehands during this period. Surely someone must have observed something unusual? "That is precisely what makes this affair so maddening, sir," Lestrade replied with evident frustration. The corridors were full of people moving about their business, chorus girls changing costumes, scene shifters preparing the next act, musicians tuning their instruments. Yet not a soul noticed anything amiss. Miss Hartley had recently ended a romantic attachment with a violinist in the orchestra, but he was performing on stage when she died and has 300 witnesses to confirm his whereabouts. I interjected, my medical training prompting the question. "The time of death was established with certainty?" "The medical examiner placed it within a narrow window of 15 minutes, Doctor, during which the violinist was visible to the entire audience. We verified this through multiple independent witnesses." Holmes paused in his pacing and turned sharply toward Lestrade. "And the third victim?" "I perceive a pattern emerging in the selection, though its significance remains obscure. Mr. Thomas Wickham, aged 32, a senior shipping clerk with the firm of Maynard and Brooks at the London docks. He was found dead at his desk yesterday evening by the night watchman during his regular rounds at 11:30. Wickham had volunteered to remain late to complete some urgent ledger work. The building was secured. All other employees had departed by 6 o'clock, and the watchman swears upon his mother's grave that no one entered or left during his watch. Yet somehow, death found its way inside. Holmes returned to his chair and sat in contemplative silence for a long moment, his eyes closed in concentration. The fog pressed against our windows with increasing density, and somewhere in the distance the mournful cry of a river steamer echoed through the yellow murk. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. "3 victims, Inspector, apparently unconnected, yet chosen with careful deliberation. The merchant, the performer, the clerk. Different social spheres, different daily routines, different locations across our great city, yet united by the same impossible circumstances and that singular theatrical signature. Someone is executing these people with a method that leaves no conventional trace, marking them with a symbol that speaks of either genuine remorse or calculated mockery." Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. "Then you will take the case, Mr. Holmes. The Commissioner is under tremendous pressure from the press, and frankly, we are at our wits' end." "Indeed I shall, Inspector. But there is one detail you have not yet shared, though I suspect it weighs heavily upon your mind. You mentioned something about a peculiar scent at each scene." Lestrade started slightly, surprised that Holmes had detected his reluctance to discuss this aspect. You are quite right, sir. At each location, our men reported a faint but distinctive aroma, like the air in a sick room after a long illness. Not quite medicinal, not quite floral, but something that lingered just long enough to be noticed before fading entirely. By the time we could bring proper equipment to analyze it, there was nothing left to examine. Holmes's eyes opened suddenly, and I saw in them the gleam that always appeared when a significant piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Now that, Inspector, is distinctly interesting. You should have led with that detail, for it suggests our killer employs some form of agent that dissipates rapidly, leaving no trace for conventional analysis. He sprang to his feet with renewed energy. We must examine these crime scenes immediately, beginning with the most recent. The shipping office will retain the clearest impressions, and I have a theory forming that requires immediate verification. Watson, fetch your coat and medical bag, Inspector. I trust the scene at the docks remains undisturbed. Sealed since last night, Mr. Holmes. I came to you immediately after securing the premises. Excellent. Then we shall begin where the trail is warmest and work backward through this curious sequence of impossible deaths. The game, as I believe I mentioned earlier, is most decidedly afoot. The journey to the London docks took us through streets, transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and mist where the fog had thickened to such density that our hansom cab proceeded at little more than walking pace. The familiar sounds of the city became muffled and distorted, creating an atmosphere of unnatural quiet broken only by the occasional clatter of wheels on cobblestones or the distant cry of a river steamer lost in the gloom. Holmes sat in rigid silence throughout the journey, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the wavering light of gas lamps that appeared and vanished like spectral sentinels in the murk. I could sense the fierce activity of his mind beneath that composed exterior, the rapid cataloguing and analysis of facts that preceded his most brilliant deductions. The offices of Maynard and Brooks emerged from the fog like the hull of some great, abandoned vessel, a stark building of soot-darkened brick that spoke of decades devoted to the prosaic business of maritime commerce. The structure stood near the water's edge, where the metallic tang of the Thames mingled with the acrid smoke of countless chimneys and the tar-scented air of the working docks. A constable stood guard at the entrance, stamping his feet against the cold and looking thoroughly miserable in the damp air. He straightened immediately upon recognizing Lestrade and admitted us through the heavy oak door with visible relief. We were met in the narrow hallway by the night watchman, a burly man named Higgins, whose face bore the pallor of recent shock. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his cap, and his voice carried the strain of a man who had witnessed something that challenged his understanding of the natural order. "I locked the building myself at 6 sharp, Inspector," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the shadowed staircase. "Made my rounds every hour as always. There's no way anyone could have entered without my knowledge, yet somehow—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought that had been tormenting him since the discovery. Holmes brushed past the man with sudden, predatory swiftness. "Show us to Wickham's office immediately. Time may be more precious than we realize." The deceased clerk's workplace occupied a corner of the second floor, a small but well-organized room that overlooked a narrow alley running parallel to the river. Gas lamps cast harsh, flickering shadows across the scene, illuminating a large oak desk piled with ledgers and shipping manifests. The chair stood pushed back slightly as though its occupant had just risen, but the space was empty now, the body having been removed to the mortuary for examination. Holmes paused at the threshold, his nostrils flaring as he drew in a deep breath. I watched him carefully, knowing that his senses were far more acute than those of ordinary men, capable of detecting subtleties that would escape less trained faculties. "The scent lingers still," he murmured, his voice low and concentrated. "Do you perceive it, Watson? Beneath the familiar odours of ink and old paper?" I inhaled cautiously and caught a faint sweetness that seemed to hover at the edge of perception. It was neither wholly pleasant nor entirely disagreeable, but carried suggestions of almonds, heavy florals, and something vaguely medicinal that reminded me of hospital corridors. "There is indeed an unusual aroma," I confirmed. "Reminiscent of ether, perhaps, though not identical." Holmes nodded approvingly and began his examination with that methodical precision I had witnessed so many times before. He dropped to his knees, producing his magnifying lens and beginning a systematic survey of the floor around the desk. His attention was caught by something near the baseboard, and he spent several minutes examining what appeared to my eyes as nothing more than ordinary dust and debris. "Interesting," he murmured, rising and turning his attention to the desk itself. "Watson, examine this ledger carefully. Note not merely the content, but the physical condition of the paper." I leaned over the open volume, observing the neat columns of figures and cargo descriptions. The handwriting was precise and methodical until the final entry, where the ink trailed off into an irregular smear, suggesting sudden collapse or distraction. The writing becomes erratic at the end, I noted, but more significantly, there appeared to be small areas of dampness on the paper itself, and what looked like tiny crystalline deposits near the spine. Holmes produced a pair of delicate forceps and carefully lifted several minute fragments from the blotter. "Salt crystals, Watson, and if I'm not mistaken, the damp areas test saline as well. Someone has been weeping in this room, yet not the victim himself." He moved abruptly to the single window, a heavy sash protected by iron bars that would indeed prevent human passage. The latch was securely fastened, and the bars showed no signs of tampering. Yet Holmes examined the frame with intense concentration, breathing upon the glass and cleaning a small circle with his handkerchief. "Observe here," he said, pointing to an almost invisible disturbance in the accumulated grime where the window sashes met. Something thin and flexible was inserted through this gap. Not to unlock the window, but to serve as a conduit. And note this circular discoloration on the sill, an oily residue that matches the substance found upon the victim's cheek. Holmes straightened, his eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. "We are dealing with a technician, gentlemen, someone who understands both chemistry and physics well enough to deliver death from the outside through an opening no wider than a needle. But he has made one crucial error. He did not account for the persistence of salt crystals in identifying his calling card." Lestrade stared at the window in amazement. "You mean the killer never entered the building at all?" "Precisely, and now we must determine why Thomas Wickham was selected as a target." Holmes returned to the desk and began examining the ledger entries with renewed interest. Suddenly his finger paused beside a name that made my blood run cold. "Edmund Carstairs," Holmes read aloud. "Listed here as a client who shipped 3 crates of Oriental silks through this very firm just 2 months ago. The dead inspector are beginning to speak to one another, and their conversation suggests a pattern far more deliberate than random selection." The fog pressed more heavily against the windows as Holmes spoke these ominous words, and I felt a chill that penetrated far deeper than the October air could account for. Somewhere in the vast sprawl of London, a killer moved with scientific precision and theatrical flair, connecting his victims through invisible threads of commerce and circumstance. The game was indeed afoot, but the rules by which it was being played grew more complex and sinister with each revelation. The discovery of Carstairs' name in Wickham's ledger seemed to galvanize Holmes with an electric intensity that I had witnessed only when he stood upon the threshold of a significant breakthrough. He bent closer to the page, his sharp eyes moving with predatory precision down the columns of neat figures, while Lestrade and I maintained a respectful silence. The fog pressed more heavily against the windows, and the faint, sweet odour that had marked each crime scene seemed to linger in the stale air of the office, as though the very atmosphere retained some memory of the tragedy that had unfolded here. "Watson, observe this entry with the utmost care," Holmes murmured, his long finger tracing a line dated some 3 months prior. "Here we have the merchant Carstairs arranging shipment of 3 crates of Oriental silk, processed through this very office by the late Thomas Wickham. But note this additional detail: the ultimate destination is listed not as a private residence, but as the Empire Theatre in Leicester Square, consigned to one Miss Clara Vane." The significance struck me immediately, and I saw Lestrade's face pale as the implication became clear. "Miss Hartley's stage name," I breathed. "All 3 victims are connected through this single transaction." "Precisely, Watson. We are not dealing with random selection, but with the systematic elimination of everyone connected to this particular shipment. Carstairs, who arranged it, Wickham, who processed it, and Miss Hartley, who received it. The pattern is as clear as it is sinister." Holmes straightened, his eyes bright, with the fierce satisfaction of a hunter who has found the trail. "But this raises a more pressing question. What could those 3 crates have contained that was worth 3 lives to conceal?" Holmes continued his examination of the ledger with renewed intensity, noting shipping dates, customs declarations, and handling procedures. The cargo originated from Calcutta, shipped aboard the merchant vessel Bangalore Star, and cleared customs without apparent difficulty. The declared value was modest, £200 for silk fabrics and embroidered goods, yet someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to eliminate every person who had intimate knowledge of this shipment. I ventured a medical observation that had been troubling me. "Holmes, the method of murder suggests someone with considerable knowledge of chemistry and physiology. The precision required to deliver a fatal agent through a window gap, the theatrical placement of tears, the rapid dissipation leaving no trace. This speaks of scientific training." "An astute observation, Watson. Our killer combines the precision of a chemist with the dramatic sensibilities of an artist. He does not merely wish to kill, but to create a signature that will be recognized and remembered. The tears are not accidental, they are a deliberate message, though to whom and for what purpose remains unclear." Lestrade shifted impatiently in his chair. "All very well, Mr. Holmes, but how do we proceed? If these 3 are dead, who else might be in danger? Surely others handled this cargo during its journey from India to London?" Holmes nodded approvingly. "An excellent question, Inspector. We must identify every individual who had contact with these specific crates, and the ship's manifest will list the captain and cargo officers, the dock workers who unloaded the goods, the customs officials who inspected them, perhaps even the cart driver who delivered them to the theatre. Any one of them might possess knowledge that our killer considers dangerous." As if summoned by our conversation, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs outside, followed by a respectful knock. The night watchman Higgins appeared in the doorway, his face bearing an expression of nervous urgency. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but there's a man downstairs asking for Inspector Lestrade. Says his name is Blackwood, Silas Blackwood, from the Oriental Cargo section. He heard about poor Mr. Wickham and says he has information about them crates from India." Holmes was on his feet instantly. "Send him up immediately, Higgins. This may be precisely the witness we require." Silas Blackwood proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, powerfully built from decades of dock labour, with weathered hands and intelligent eyes that held a mixture of grief and fear. He removed his cap respectfully as he entered, but his gaze darted nervously about the room as though he expected danger to materialize from the shadows. "I knew Tom Wickham well, sirs," he began without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. "A good man, careful with his work. When I heard he was dead, and in such a queer way, I knew I had to speak up about them Indian crates." Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. "You handled the specific shipment we are investigating?" "Aye, sir. 3 crates marked with the seal of Sharma and Dutt of Calcutta. Heavy they were, heavier than silk ought to be, and cold to the touch, even in the summer heat. But it weren't just the weight that troubled me. It was the smell that came from them when we shifted them in the warehouse. Sweet and sickly, like flowers left too long in a tomb. The description sent a chill through me, matching perfectly the mysterious odor we had detected at each crime scene. Holmes's eyes gleamed with fierce satisfaction. "Did you observe anything else unusual about these particular crates, Mr. Blackwood? Any individuals who showed unusual interest in them?" Blackwood's face grew pale, and he glanced toward the window as though expecting to see some dreadful figure materialize from the fog. "There was a man, sir, watching from the shadows when we unloaded them. Tall and thin he was, wrapped in a dark cloak despite the warm weather. He never came close, never spoke to anyone, but his eyes never left those crates. And the strangest thing, gentlemen, he was weeping. Tears running down his face like rain, but he made no sound, just stood there watching and crying like his heart was broken." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. Here at last was a witness to the mysterious figure whose tears had marked each victim, the weeping killer who had haunted London's fog-shrouded streets. "Have you seen this man since that day?" Holmes asked with barely contained excitement. "Once more, sir, just 2 nights past. I was working late, securing the warehouse, when I glimpsed him standing in the alley behind this very building. Same cloak, same sorrowful face. He was staring up at the window where poor Tom worked, and I swear he was weeping again. I thought to challenge him, but something about his manner chilled my blood. I locked myself inside until morning, and now Tom is dead." Holmes rose and began pacing the narrow confines of the office, his mind clearly racing to process this new intelligence. "Mr. Blackwood, you have provided us with invaluable information, but I fear you may now be in considerable danger yourself. You are a witness who can identify our killer, and he has already demonstrated his willingness to eliminate anyone who threatens his secret." The dock worker's face grew even paler. "You think he might come for me, sir?" "I think it highly probable. Inspector Lestrade, I suggest Mr. Blackwood be placed under protective custody immediately. Meanwhile, we must obtain the complete shipping manifest for the Bangalore Star and identify every individual who had contact with those accursed crates. Our weeping killer is methodically removing all traces of whatever secret lies hidden in that cargo, and we must reach the truth before he completes his deadly work." As we prepared to escort Blackwood to safety, I could not shake the image his words had painted. A cloaked figure, standing in the fog, tears streaming down his face as he watched and waited. What terrible knowledge drove this man to such elaborate murder? What secret was worth the lives of 3 innocent people, and how many more would die before we could unravel the mystery of the weeping killer who stalked London's shadowed streets? The arrangements for Blackwood's protection were concluded with admirable efficiency, 2 sturdy constables escorting the frightened dock worker into the fog-shrouded night toward a secure lodging near Scotland Yard. As their footsteps faded into the yellow murk, Holmes remained at the entrance to the shipping office, his sharp profile silhouetted against the wavering gaslight. I could sense the rapid calculations proceeding behind those penetrating grey eyes, the systematic cataloguing of facts that preceded his most brilliant deductions. "The pattern grows clearer, Watson," he murmured, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. "Our killer does not strike at random, but follows a methodical plan to eliminate every individual who possessed intimate knowledge of those accursed crates. Yet there is something deeply personal in his approach, something that transcends mere necessity. The tears, the lingering presence at crime scenes, the theatrical precision of his method, this speaks of a man driven by profound emotion as well as calculated purpose. We made our way through streets that seemed to exist in some netherworld between reality and nightmare, where familiar landmarks emerged from the fog like half-remembered phantoms before vanishing again into the yellow void. Our destination was the head office of the Eastern Maritime Company, the shipping line responsible for the Bangalore Star and her cargo from Calcutta. Holmes had insisted we examine the complete voyage records, convinced that somewhere in those meticulous documents lay the key to understanding both the killer's identity and his motive. The company's offices occupied a substantial building near the custom house, its windows glowing warmly against the oppressive darkness of the night. We found the duty manager, a nervous gentleman named Hartwell, waiting for us with evident reluctance. Only Lestrade's official credentials and the mention of the weeping murders sufficed to overcome his initial resistance to disturbing the sacred archives at such an unseemly hour. The manifest for the Bangalore Star proved to be a treasure trove of information, far more detailed than the abbreviated records we had examined at Wickham's office. Holmes spread the documents across a heavy oak table and began his examination with that intense focus that seemed to exclude all awareness of his surroundings. His long fingers traced down columns of entries, while his eyes moved with extraordinary rapidity, absorbing and cataloguing every detail. "Observe, Watson," he said after several minutes of concentrated study. "The complete chain of custody for our mysterious cargo. Captain James Weatherby commanded the vessel, with First Officer Michael Dennison responsible for cargo security. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Edmund Blackthorne, filed a report concerning the incident with the dock porter in Calcutta. Most significantly, there was a passenger aboard who travelled as far as Suez, one Professor Alastair Finch, described as a botanical consultant attached to the shipment." Holmes straightened abruptly, his face bearing that expression of grim realization I had learned to recognize. "A botanical consultant, Watson, travelling with what was declared as silk textiles. The incongruity is glaring, yet it passed unquestioned through official channels. This Professor Finch disembarked at Suez and did not continue to London, yet the shipping records show correspondence was sent to him at a London address upon the cargo's safe arrival." He turned to Hartwell with sharp intensity. "This correspondence address for Professor Finch, you have it recorded?" The manager consulted his files with trembling fingers. "Yes, sir. Number 47 Montague Street, Bloomsbury. We sent confirmation of delivery there as a matter of routine, though we received no acknowledgement." The significance of this revelation was not lost upon me. Bloomsbury lay within comfortable walking distance of all three crime scenes, and a man with botanical expertise would certainly possess the scientific knowledge necessary to construct the elaborate apparatus Holmes had theorized. Yet something in my friend's expression suggested he had detected an even more sinister implication. "Lestrade," Holmes commanded with urgent authority, "we must immediately locate and interview every individual who had direct contact with this cargo during its voyage or subsequent handling. Captain Weatherby, First Officer Dennison, Dr. Blackthorne, the customs inspector who examined the crates upon arrival. Any one of them might be our killer's next target." The inspector nodded gravely. I'll dispatch men to track them down at once, though finding anyone in this accursed fog will be no simple task." Holmes was already moving toward the door, with that nervous energy that possessed him when time became a critical factor. "Then we must begin immediately with those we can locate. Watson, the customs records will show us who conducted the official inspection of these crates upon their arrival. That individual would have had the most thorough knowledge of their actual contents, and thus represents the greatest threat to whatever secret our killer seeks to protect." The journey to the custom house took us back toward the river, where the fog seemed to rise from the Thames itself like some malevolent exhalation. The building stood dark and forbidding against the night sky, its windows reflecting the wavering light of gas lamps like watching eyes. A night clerk, roused from his comfortable drowse by our urgent knocking, grudgingly provided access to the inspection records for the period in question. Holmes seized upon the relevant documents with fierce intensity, his magnifying lens moving rapidly across the faded entries. "Here we have it," he announced. "Inspector Arthur Grayson conducted the examination of the Carstairs shipment on July the 23rd. His report notes cargo consistent with declared contents and no irregularities observed, yet there is a curious addendum in different ink, added, apparently, at a later date." He held the document closer to the lamp. The addendum reads, "Subsequent inquiry regarding botanical specimens, matter referred to Professor A. Finch per departmental instruction." "Watson, this suggests that questions were raised about the cargo's true nature, and that Professor Finch was somehow involved in resolving those questions." A chill passed through me that had nothing to do with the October air. "Holmes, if Inspector Grayson discovered something irregular about those crates, and if Professor Finch was brought in to address the matter, then both men possess knowledge that could expose whatever secret lies at the heart of this affair." "Precisely, Watson. And if our theory is correct, one or both of them may already be marked for death." Holmes was moving again with swift purpose. "We must reach Inspector Grayson immediately. His address will be on file with the customs authority, and every minute we delay may bring our weeping killer closer to claiming another victim." As we prepared to venture once more into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I could not shake the feeling that we were racing against time itself. Somewhere in the yellow murk that had transformed our familiar city into an alien landscape, a killer moved with scientific precision and deadly purpose. The pattern of his murders suggested a methodical mind working to eliminate all traces of some terrible secret, yet the tears he left upon each victim spoke of emotions that ran far deeper than mere calculation. The game was indeed afoot, but the stakes grew higher with each revelation, and I feared we might already be too late to prevent the next chapter in this macabre sequence of impossible deaths. The fog pressed more heavily against the windows of our cab as we rattled through the darkened streets, and somewhere, in that impenetrable veil, death stalked with tears glistening upon its cheeks, weeping for victims yet to come, while methodically preparing their destruction. Inspector Arthur Grayson resided in a modest terrace house in Kennington, a respectable neighbourhood south of the Thames, where civil servants and minor officials made their homes among neat rows of brick dwellings that spoke of steady income and quiet respectability. Our hansom cab navigated the fog-shrouded streets with painful deliberation, the driver calling out warnings to pedestrians who materialized like phantoms from the yellow murk before vanishing again into the impenetrable veil that had transformed London into an alien landscape. Holmes sat rigid, with barely contained urgency, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm against his knee, while his sharp eyes stared into the fog as though he might penetrate its depths through sheer force of will. The house before us presented a facade as dark and silent as a mausoleum, its windows reflecting nothing but the wavering light of distant gas lamps. Holmes was out of the cab before it had fully stopped, striding up the narrow path with that decisive energy I had learned to recognize as the harbinger of significant discovery. His sharp rap upon the door echoed hollowly in the fog-muffled air, unanswered. A second knock produced the same ominous silence that seemed to press against us with almost physical weight. "The door is unlocked," Holmes announced grimly, testing the handle. "Inspector Grayson was either expecting a visitor or has already received one." He pushed the door open, revealing a narrow hallway that smelled of old tobacco and furniture polish, ordinary domestic scents that could not quite mask something else, that same faint, sickly sweet aroma we had encountered at each previous crime scene. We moved through the darkened house with Holmes leading, his matches providing flickering illumination as we searched each room methodically. The sitting room revealed nothing unusual, nor did the small kitchen beyond, but when we climbed the narrow staircase to the upper floor, the sweet odour grew stronger with each step, mingling now with something that reminded me unpleasantly of the almond scent I associated with certain chemical compounds from my medical training. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and Holmes pushed it open with the tip of his walking stick rather than touching the handle directly. Our lamplight fell upon Inspector Arthur Grayson, lying peacefully upon his bed, fully dressed save for his shoes, which had been placed with careful precision beside the nightstand. His hands were folded across his chest in an attitude of repose, but his eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling with an expression of profound surprise. Upon his left cheek, catching our lamplight with terrible clarity, glistened the now familiar single tear that marked each victim of this methodical killer. Holmes approached the body with that careful deliberation I had witnessed at every crime scene, examining without touching, while his trained senses absorbed every detail. "Dead perhaps 2 hours," he murmured, his voice low and concentrated. The slight discoloration around the lips and the faint almond scent suggest a prussic compound, but administered with the same precision we observed previously. Yet this time, our killer has grown bolder, entering the house itself rather than working from outside. I examined the window, finding it securely latched from within, while Holmes turned his attention to a small writing table near the bed, where papers lay in apparent disorder. 2 glasses sat upon the nightstand, both showing traces of what appeared to be brandy, though one remained nearly full, while the other showed clear evidence of use. "Most significant, Watson," Holmes observed, his magnifying lens moving across the glasses with methodical precision. 2 glasses, suggesting Grayson was entertaining a guest he trusted sufficiently to share a drink. Our victim knew his murderer and admitted him willingly, perhaps even expected his visit. This narrows our field of suspects considerably to those individuals directly connected to the mysterious cargo from India. Holmes gathered several documents from the writing table, holding them to our lamplight with careful attention. "Grayson has been conducting his own investigation into the Carstairs shipment," he announced, his voice carrying that note of grim satisfaction I recognized as the sound of puzzle pieces falling into place. "Here is an unfinished letter addressed to Edmund Carstairs himself, dated this very evening. Listen to this passage. My dear sir, I feel compelled to write regarding certain irregularities I discovered in your recent shipment from Calcutta. The botanical specimens concealed within the silk consignments were not declared to customs, and I have reason to believe they may be connected to matters of considerable gravity. A gentleman claiming authority from the Foreign Office, one who gave his name as Mycroft Holmes, instructed me to overlook these discrepancies, but my conscience will no longer permit." The writing ends there, Watson. the pen having fallen from his dying hand. The mention of that familiar name sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October air. Holmes's face had grown pale, though whether from anger or alarm I could not determine. "Someone has used my brother's name to intimidate Grayson into silence," Holmes said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "A bold deception that suggests our adversary knows exactly who is pursuing him and seeks to implicate my family in this sordid business. But he has made a crucial error in doing so, for now we know he fears exposure enough to invoke false authority." Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming with fierce determination. "The pattern grows clearer, Watson. Grayson discovered something irregular about those crates, botanical specimens concealed within declared silk shipments, and someone claiming governmental authority ordered him to remain silent. When his conscience finally compelled him to speak, he was silenced permanently. But his letter confirms our theory. Professor Alistair Finch is the key to this entire affair." He moved toward the door with renewed purpose. "We must reach Montague Street immediately. If Grayson was murdered to prevent his revelations, then Finch represents either our next victim or our primary suspect. Either way, time may be running short, and the fog that has aided our killer throughout this investigation may soon lift to reveal truths that someone has killed repeatedly to conceal." As we prepared to leave that house of death, I could not shake the feeling that we were approaching the heart of a conspiracy far more complex than a simple series of murders. The invocation of Mycroft Holmes's name suggested connections to matters of state, while the botanical specimens hinted at secrets that had travelled halfway around the world to find their deadly flowering in the fog-shrouded streets of London. The journey to Bloomsbury proved a harrowing passage through streets transformed into something from a fever dream, where the fog had thickened to such density that our hansom cab proceeded at little more than walking pace. Our driver was forced to dismount repeatedly, leading his horse by the bridle while calling out warnings to invisible pedestrians who materialized like phantoms from the yellow murk before vanishing again into the impenetrable veil. Holmes sat beside me in rigid silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the wavering light of gas lamps that appeared and disappeared like spectral beacons in the gloom. I could sense the cold fury radiating from him, a controlled intensity born not merely from professional interest, but from personal affront at the misuse of his brother's name in this sordid affair. The mention of Mycroft Holmes in Grayson's unfinished letter had transformed what began as an intellectual puzzle into something approaching a personal vendetta. My friend's usual detached fascination with criminal methodology had given way to a more dangerous emotion, and I recognized the signs of a man whose family honor had been deliberately besmirched by an adversary who understood exactly how to provoke him. This was no longer merely about justice for the victims, but about exposing whoever had dared to implicate the Holmes name in these calculated murders. Montague Street emerged from the fog as a respectable thoroughfare of Georgian houses, their facades presenting that air of faded gentility common to neighborhoods where scholars and professional men made their homes among dusty books and modest furnishings. Number 47 stood near the end of the street, a handsome townhouse that bore the unmistakable signs of recent abandonment. Unlike the other residences along the street, where warm lamplight glowed behind curtained windows, this house presented a facade as dark and silent as a tomb, its windows reflecting nothing but the wavering light of distant gas lamps. Holmes approached the front door with that predatory caution I had learned to recognize as the prelude to significant discovery. The entrance stood slightly ajar, revealing a darkness within that seemed to possess an almost palpable quality of menace. No sound emerged from the interior, no flicker of movement or shadow to suggest human occupation, yet The very stillness seemed pregnant with hidden meaning. Holmes produced his revolver from his coat pocket, and I followed suit, the familiar weight of my service weapon bringing a measure of grim comfort as we prepared to enter what might well prove to be another scene of carefully orchestrated death. We crossed the threshold with the utmost stealth, our footsteps muffled by a carpet that had once been fine, but now showed signs of neglect and wear. The air within carried the distinctive musty scent of a dwelling long unoccupied, mingled with something else that made my blood run cold, that same faint, sweet odour we had encountered at every crime scene, though here it seemed stronger, more concentrated, as though we had finally reached the source of that mysterious fragrance that marked each victim of our weeping killer. Holmes struck a match, illuminating a narrow hallway lined with botanical prints and scientific diagrams depicting various exotic plants in meticulous detail. The walls were crowded with framed illustrations of tropical flora, each specimen labelled in precise Latin nomenclature that spoke of serious scientific study. A sitting room to our right revealed shelves groaning under the weight of specimen jars and leather-bound volumes, while a small laboratory visible through an open doorway beyond suggested research work of considerable sophistication conducted within these modest premises. Yet everything bore a layer of dust that spoke of months of abandonment, and no sign of recent occupation disturbed the accumulated debris of disuse. Papers lay scattered across a desk in the laboratory, their edges curled with age and damp, while glass apparatus stood empty and forgotten beneath sheets of protective cloth that had grown grey with neglect. "Professor Finch has not resided here for some considerable time," Holmes observed, his voice barely above a whisper, as he moved deeper into the house. Yet the shipping records indicated correspondence was sent to this address as recently as 3 months ago. Either he maintained this location merely as a forwarding point while residing elsewhere, or someone else has been collecting his mail and managing his affairs. We ascended a narrow staircase to the upper floor, where 3 doors opened onto what appeared to be bedrooms and a study. The study drew Holmes immediately, and our lamplight revealed a room that stood in stark contrast to the abandoned state of the rest of the house. Here, everything was orderly and maintained, the desk clear save for a leather-bound journal and several sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting that appeared fresh and recent. The botanical specimens in glass cases along the walls showed signs of careful tending, and the air held that distinctive sweet scent with almost overwhelming intensity. Holmes seized the journal with barely contained excitement, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages as he absorbed their contents. I watched his expression transform from intense concentration to something approaching horror as the implications of what he read became clear. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the turning of pages and the distant sound of fog-muffled traffic in the street below. "Watson," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight of terrible understanding, "this journal chronicles the final months of Professor Alastair Finch's life, but it was not written by his hand. Listen to this entry dated 4 months ago. Father's expedition to the hill country near Darjeeling has yielded discoveries that exceed even our most optimistic projections, though the price of his research grows higher with each passing day. Specimens he has collected possess properties that could revolutionize both medicine and warfare, but the colonial authorities have become aware of his work and seek to suppress it." Holmes turned several pages, his finger tracing lines of increasingly desperate prose. The subsequent entries speak of smuggling the botanical specimens out of India concealed within legitimate cargo, of bribing officials and falsifying customs documents. But here, Watson, we find the crucial revelation. Professor Finch did not survive the voyage. He died of fever somewhere in the Red Sea, but not before entrusting his life's work to someone who swore to protect it at any cost. I felt a chill of understanding as the pattern became clear. Then we are dealing not with Professor Finch himself, but with someone who inherited his research and his obsession. Precisely, Watson. And that someone has been systematically eliminating every individual who possessed knowledge that could expose the illegal importation of these botanical specimens. But observe this final entry, written just 3 days ago. The work nears completion, though the cost in human lives weighs heavily upon my conscience. Each death is a necessary sacrifice to protect Father's legacy, yet I find myself weeping for every soul I am forced to claim. The irony is not lost upon me that the very toxin I employ stimulates the tear ducts, making my grief manifest even as I deliver justice to those who would destroy what Father died to preserve. Holmes closed the journal with careful deliberation, his face grave with the implications of what we had discovered. Our killer is not merely eliminating witnesses, Watson. He believes himself to be protecting a scientific legacy of immense value, justifying murder in the name of preserving knowledge. The tears he leaves upon each victim are not theatrical affectation, but the physical manifestation of genuine grief, even as he commits these calculated killings. The revelation cast our investigation in an entirely new light. We were not dealing with a cold-blooded murderer driven by greed or revenge, but with someone who saw himself as a guardian of precious knowledge, willing to kill to protect what he perceived as his father's greatest achievement. The scientific precision of the murders, the elaborate methods designed to leave no conventional trace, the theatrical signature of the tears, all of it spoke of a mind that combined brilliant intellect with profound emotional disturbance. Holmes moved to a locked cabinet near the window, producing his collection of picks to work at the mechanism with practiced skill. The lock yielded after a moment, revealing rows of glass vials containing what appeared to be dried plant specimens and various chemical preparations. One vial in particular caught his attention, its contents a crystalline powder that seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence in our lamplight. "Here we have the source of our mystery," he announced, holding the vial with careful reverence. "The processed extract of whatever botanical specimens Professor Finch smuggled from India. Note the faint floral scent even through the sealed glass. And observe how the powder seems to sublime slightly, even at room temperature, releasing vapors that could easily be delivered through the apparatus we have theorized." As Holmes spoke these words, a sound from below froze us both in place. The soft creak of a floorboard, followed by footsteps ascending the stairs with measured deliberation. Holmes extinguished our lamp instantly, plunging us into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of street lamps filtering through the fog outside. We positioned ourselves on either side of the doorway, weapons ready, as the footsteps drew nearer with inexorable certainty. The game had taken a decisive turn, and I realized we were about to come face to face with the weeping killer who had haunted London's fog-shrouded streets. Whether he came as hunter or hunted remained to be seen, but the confrontation we had been building toward throughout this investigation was finally at hand. The footsteps paused at the threshold, and in that suspended moment of absolute silence, I could hear nothing save the distant murmur of fog-muffled traffic and the rapid beating of my own heart. Holmes remained motionless beside me in the darkness, his revolver trained upon the doorway with unwavering steadiness, while I fought to control my breathing as we waited for whatever revelation was about to unfold. The handle turned with agonizing deliberation, its brass mechanism protesting faintly against months of disuse, before the door swung inward to reveal a slender silhouette framed against the dim gaslight of the landing beyond. The figure struck a match with trembling fingers, its sudden flare illuminating a face that bore the unmistakable stamp of profound suffering. The man before us was perhaps 30 years of age, tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned with the feverish intensity of someone pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. His dark hair clung damply to his temples as though he suffered from fever, and his entire bearing spoke of a soul crushed beneath some terrible burden. Most striking of all were his eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, from which tears flowed with disturbing regularity, tracing pale tracks through the grime upon his face. He moved directly toward the specimen cabinet with single-minded purpose, his attention so completely fixed upon his objective that he failed entirely to perceive our presence in the shadows. It was only when his searching fingers found empty space where the vials had stood moments before that a cry of genuine anguish escaped his lips. He spun around, the match falling from his nerveless grasp to expire upon the carpet, plunging us once more into darkness, broken only by the faint glow filtering through the fog-shrouded windows. "I would advise against any sudden movement," Holmes announced, his voice cutting through the gloom with calm authority. "Dr. Watson has his service revolver trained upon you, and I assure you that his military training remains unimpaired by the current lighting conditions. Strike another match, if you please, and let us discuss this matter in a civilized manner." There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by the scrape of another lucifer against its box. The renewed flame revealed our quarry standing with his back pressed against the window frame, his expression a complex mixture of terror, defiance, and something that looked remarkably like relief. His gaze moved from Holmes to me, lingering upon the weapon in my hand, before his shoulders sagged in a gesture of complete surrender. He sank into the chair beside the writing desk, burying his face in his hands, as violent tremors shook his slight frame. "It is finished, then," he whispered, his voice breaking with exhaustion and something approaching gratitude. "I confess I am almost glad. The burden has grown too heavy for any mortal soul to bear alone." Holmes stepped into the circle of flickering light, his sharp features grave but not unsympathetic. "You are Dr. Marcus Finch, son of the late Professor Alastair Finch, and the author of 4 carefully planned murders designed to protect your father's botanical research from exposure. You are the man who has stalked London's fog-shrouded streets with tears upon his face and death concealed within his apparatus." The young man looked up, and I was struck by the devastation written upon his features. The tears continued to flow with mechanical precision, as though driven by some physiological compulsion rather than mere emotion. 4 deaths, he confirmed, his voice barely audible. 4 necessary sacrifices to preserve knowledge that could transform our understanding of both medicine and the darker aspects of human nature. My father spent 15 years in the hill country near Darjeeling, studying botanical specimens whose properties exceeded anything known to Western science. He discovered compounds that could revolutionize the treatment of pain and suffering, yet he also found plants whose extracts could kill without leaving the slightest trace of conventional poison. Holmes leaned forward with keen interest, his analytical mind clearly cataloguing every detail of the confession. "Your father died during the voyage from India, but not before making you swear to protect his research at any cost. You concealed the specimens within the silk shipments, falsified customs declarations, and believed you had succeeded in bringing his life's work safely to England." "Precisely, Mr. Holmes, but I discovered that others possessed knowledge of the deception. Carstairs, who arranged the shipment, Wickham, who processed the documentation, Miss Hartley, who inadvertently received specimens among her theatrical costumes, and Inspector Grayson, who detected irregularities during his customs examination. Each of them threatened to expose what my father had died to protect." Dr. Finch's hands trembled as he spoke, and I observed with growing fascination that his tears continued to flow with disturbing regularity, suggesting some physiological rather than purely emotional cause. Holmes evidently noticed the same phenomenon, for his eyes sharpened with scientific interest. "The tears that marked each of your victims," Holmes said slowly, "they were not merely a theatrical signature, were they? You placed them there because you could not help yourself. The very toxin you employed to commit these murders caused your own lacrimal glands to produce tears with abnormal frequency." A bitter smile crossed the young doctor's ravaged features. "You have identified the cruel irony at the heart of this affair, Mr. Holmes. The botanical extract I refined from my father's specimens produces what medical science terms hyperlacrimation in anyone exposed to even minute quantities of its vapors. Every time I prepared my delivery apparatus, handled the crystalline powder, or breathed the faint emanations from my equipment, my eyes would water uncontrollably. I found myself literally weeping for my victims even as I delivered their deaths through windows and keyholes, using the very compounds my father had discovered to create the perfect untraceable murder." Holmes moved to examine the empty cabinet, his long fingers tracing the spaces where the vials had stood. "You developed a portable delivery system based upon your father's research, capable of administering a fatal dose through the narrowest opening while leaving no conventional trace of poison. The sweet odor detected at each crime scene, the rapid dissipation of evidence, the absence of visible wounds, all explained by your scientific precision." "I am not a murderer by nature, gentlemen," Dr. Finch pleaded, his voice rising with desperate sincerity. "I am a physician who took an oath to preserve life, yet I was forced to take it in order to protect knowledge that could save thousands. If those botanical extracts had fallen into the hands of governments or military forces, imagine the consequences: a weapon that kills without leaving wounds, without traces that conventional analysis could detect, producing only corpses that appear to have died of natural causes. I had to eliminate everyone who knew of the illegal shipment, everyone who might have retained samples or documented the discrepancies." The young man reached slowly into his coat, causing both Holmes and myself to tense with weapons raised. But what he withdrew was not a weapon, but a leather satchel containing several glass vials identical to those we had discovered in the cabinet. "I have brought the remaining concentrate with me tonight, Mr. Holmes. Everything I managed to synthesize from my father's original specimens. I came here intending to destroy it all, to burn away the last traces of knowledge that has cost so many innocent lives." Holmes extended his hand with quiet authority. "Then you shall surrender it to me, Dr. Finch, and we shall ensure that your father's discovery receives the careful scientific study it deserves. Under proper supervision and with appropriate safeguards, the deaths you have caused cannot be undone, but the knowledge need not perish with its guardian." As the weeping killer placed his deadly legacy into Holmes's capable hands, I realized we had reached not merely the solution to our mystery, but the beginning of questions that would extend far beyond the fog-shrouded streets of London into realms of science and morality that challenged the very foundations of civilized society. Holmes secured the deadly vials with meticulous care, wrapping them in his handkerchief before examining their contents under the flickering gaslight. I observed him with growing concern as he studied the crystalline powder within, noting how the substance seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence that spoke of chemical instability. The sweet, cloying odor that had marked each crime scene hung heavily in the air around us, more concentrated here than we had encountered anywhere else, and I felt an involuntary shudder as I contemplated the lethal potential contained within those innocent-looking glass containers. Dr. Marcus Finch remained slumped in his chair, tears flowing with that mechanical regularity that had become his defining characteristic. His hands trembled as he began to describe the apparatus he had constructed, his voice taking on the precise cadence of a scientific lecture, even as his body betrayed the emotional toll of his confessions. The delivery system was elegantly simple, he explained, his words barely above a whisper. I adapted a laboratory bellows, coupling it with telescoping copper tubes of varying lengths. The powder sublimates rapidly when warmed by body heat, creating vapors that could be directed through any opening no wider than a pencil, a keyhole, a crack in a window frame, the gap beneath a door. Any of these provided sufficient access. Holmes leaned forward with intense interest, his analytical mind cataloguing every detail of the method. The victims would have had no warning, no opportunity to resist or cry out. The compound acts upon the respiratory centers first, I presume, producing paralysis before affecting the cardiac system. Precisely, Mr. Holmes. Death follows within moments, and by the time the room's natural ventilation has diluted the concentration, nothing remains that conventional analysis could detect. The sweet odor dissipates rapidly, leaving only the faintest trace for those with sufficiently trained senses to perceive. Finch's voice broke slightly as he continued. I told myself it was merciful, that they felt no pain, but the truth is I chose this method because it served my purposes perfectly, untraceable, efficient, and requiring no physical proximity to the victim. I had been studying the young physician with my trained medical eye, noting symptoms that extended far beyond mere emotional distress. His pallor had a greyish quality I associated with systemic poisoning. His pulse was rapid and irregular when I checked his wrist, and the persistent lacrimation suggested more than simple grief. Holmes, I interjected. Observe his physical condition carefully. The tremors, the excessive tearing, the cyanotic tinge to his fingernails, these are not the symptoms of a man suffering merely from guilt and exhaustion. Holmes's sharp gaze fixed upon Finch with renewed intensity. You have been systematically poisoning yourself through repeated exposure to your father's discovery, have you not, Doctor? The protective measures you employed were insufficient against the cumulative effects of handling such potent compounds. A bitter smile crossed Finch's ravaged features. Your deduction is accurate, as always. I realized several weeks ago that the toxin accumulates in the system, that each time I prepared my apparatus or breathed the faint vapors from my equipment, I was administering minute doses to myself. The irony is profound. The very compound I used to eliminate those who threatened my father's secret is now claiming its final victim. I am dying, Mr. Holmes, killed by the knowledge I sought to protect. The revelation cast our investigation in an even more tragic light. Here was a man who had committed 4 calculated murders, yet who was himself a victim of the deadly legacy he had inherited. Holmes moved to examine the remaining vials more closely, his face grave as he observed their contents. These specimens are becoming increasingly unstable, he announced with evident concern. The heat of this room is accelerating their sublimation. We require immediate transport to a facility equipped to handle such dangerous materials safely. As if summoned by the urgency of our situation, heavy footsteps sounded upon the stairs below, followed by the familiar voice of Inspector Lestrade calling out through the fog-muffled night. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, are you within? The inspector appeared in the doorway moments later, flanked by 2 sturdy constables, his face flushed from exertion and his coat dripping with condensed fog. His eyes took in the scene before him, the slumped figure of Finch, the vials upon the desk, and our grim expressions with the quick comprehension of an experienced police officer. You have found your weeping killer, then? Lestrade observed, his voice carrying both satisfaction and wariness as he studied the broken man in the chair. Though he appears to be in somewhat worse condition than our usual prisoners. Inspector Lestrade, I present to you Dr. Marcus Finch, son of the late Professor Alistair Finch, and the perpetrator of 4 ingeniously planned murders, Holmes announced formally. He has confessed to the deaths of Edmund Carstairs, Constance Hartley, Thomas Wickham, and Arthur Grayson, all committed using a botanical toxin of extraordinary potency smuggled from India. However, he is also a dying man, poisoned by his own weapon, and requires immediate medical attention if he is to survive long enough to face trial. Lestrade signalled to his constables, who approached Finch with appropriate caution. The young doctor offered no resistance as they helped him to his feet, his body sagging between them like a man already half dead. "It was necessary," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Each death was a sacrifice to preserve knowledge that could have changed the world, for better or worse. My father spent 15 years discovering compounds that could revolutionize medicine, yet in the wrong hands they would have become weapons of unimaginable horror." Holmes carefully gathered the remaining documents from the desk while keeping the deadly satchel well away from any source of heat or flame. "There remains one crucial mystery, Dr. Finch. Inspector Grayson's unfinished letter mentioned that someone claiming to represent the Foreign Office, someone who gave the name Mycroft Holmes, had instructed him to overlook the irregularities in your shipment. This deception was not of your making, I presume." Confusion flickered across Finch's tear-streaked face. "I know nothing of such an intervention, Mr. Holmes. I learned of Grayson's suspicions through my own surveillance of the Customs Office, watching for any sign that my deception had been detected. If someone else sought to suppress his investigation, they did so without my knowledge or consent." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me, and I saw in his expression the same troubling realization that had begun to form in my own mind. Someone else had been manipulating events behind the scenes, someone with sufficient audacity to invoke his brother's name in pursuit of their own mysterious agenda. The weeping murders we had been investigating were merely the visible surface of a conspiracy that extended into territories we had yet to explore. As Lestrade's men prepared to escort their prisoner into the fog-shrouded night, Holmes turned his attention to the immediate dangers posed by the remaining specimens. "Inspector, these chemicals represent a threat far beyond your usual evidence lockers. They must be transported with extreme care to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where the laboratory facilities are adequate to ensure their safe destruction. I shall personally oversee their handling, as any mishap could prove catastrophic." The young physician looked back one final time at the desk where his father's deadly legacy lay contained in leather and glass, his eyes still streaming with those chemically induced tears that had become his tragic signature. "Some knowledge is too dangerous for this world to possess," he murmured as they led him away. "My father thought he had discovered miracles, but he only unearthed curses that destroy everything they touch." As the sound of footsteps faded down the staircase, Holmes and I remained alone in the abandoned study, surrounded by the detritus of a brilliant mind's descent into madness and murder. The fog pressed more heavily against the windows, and somewhere in its yellow depths questions remained unanswered about the mysterious figure who had sought to manipulate official channels in service of unknown purposes. "The case is far from closed, Watson," Holmes observed quietly, securing the satchel with careful precision. "We have caught our weeping killer, but the shadow of conspiracy still hangs over this affair. Someone with access to governmental authority sought to suppress Grayson's investigation, and that someone remains at large, their motives and identity still shrouded in mystery." The game had taken yet another turn and as we prepared to escort the deadly specimens to their destruction, I could not shake the feeling that we had solved only the most visible layer of a puzzle whose deeper implications would continue to haunt us long after the fog had lifted from London's darkened streets. The journey to St. Bartholomew's Hospital proved to be an exercise in controlled terror, our hansom cab proceeding through streets where the fog had begun to thin but still clung to the buildings like malevolent drapery. Holmes sat beside me with the leather satchel containing Professor Finch's deadly legacy resting upon his knees, his hands maintaining constant contact with it as though he feared it might somehow escape his vigilance. The sweet, cloying odor that had marked each crime scene seemed to seep through the leather despite our precautions, serving as a constant reminder of the lethal potential contained within those innocent-looking glass vials. Every jolt of the cab over uneven cobblestones sent a chill through me as I contemplated what might happen should one of those containers shatter. We arrived at the hospital well past midnight, the familiar building rendered strange and forbidding by the oppressive atmosphere that had transformed London into an alien landscape. Holmes had sent word ahead through one of Lestrade's constables, and we were met at the entrance by Dr. Stamford, my old dresser from student days, who had agreed to provide access to the chemistry laboratory despite the unseemly hour. His expression combined professional curiosity with evident concern as he observed the meticulous care with which Holmes handled the satchel. The laboratory stood empty and cold, smelling sharply of antiseptic and sulfur compounds, a welcome contrast to the sickly sweetness that had permeated every crime scene. Holmes immediately set about arranging the deadly vials upon a slate workbench, lighting a Bunsen burner with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what we were attempting. He selected various reagents from the shelves with the precision of a master chemist: concentrated hydrochloric acid, potassium permanganate, and solutions of heavy metal salts that would neutralize the botanical toxin through controlled chemical destruction. I watched in fascination as he worked, the blue flame of the burner casting dancing shadows across his sharp features while he moved with that economy of motion that characterized his approach to all problems of sufficient complexity. He decanted the iridescent powder into a sealed retort, adding the reagents drop by careful drop while maintaining perfect ventilation to prevent any contamination of the surrounding air. A violent reaction ensued, the mixture hissing and changing color from that sinister violet shimmer to a harmless muddy brown, releasing plumes of acrid smoke that were immediately drawn away by the powerful ventilation system. "The molecular structure is alkaloid-based," Holmes remarked, without looking up from his work, his eyes fixed upon the bubbling retort. "Similar to aconite in its basic configuration, but with a complexity that defies conventional classification. Professor Finch did indeed discover something extraordinary in those Indian hills, Watson. The compound creates complete neuromuscular blockade while simultaneously overstimulating the lacrimal glands, forcing its victims to weep for their own destruction, ingenious in its precision and utterly diabolical in its application. One by one, the vials were emptied and their contents rendered inert through the application of superior scientific knowledge. It was both a practical necessity and a symbolic act, the destruction of a cursed legacy that had brought nothing but sorrow to everyone it touched. As the final mixture turned harmless in the retort, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had not fully realized I was carrying. "And now it is gone," I observed, watching the last traces of the deadly compound neutralized beyond any possibility of recovery. "The world is safer for its destruction." "Is it indeed?" a deep, resonant voice inquired from the shadows of the doorway, startling us both from our contemplation. We turned to find Mycroft Holmes standing at the entrance, his massive frame filling the doorway, while he leaned heavily upon his gold-handled walking stick. His face bore that expression of weary resignation I had learned to associate with matters of governmental complexity, though I detected something that might have been genuine regret flickering in his heavy-lidded eyes. Holmes straightened, carefully cleaning his hands upon a laboratory towel while his expression hardened with barely controlled anger. "I anticipated you might make an appearance, brother mine. You possess an uncanny ability to manifest whenever my private investigations collide with matters of state security." Mycroft entered the room with his characteristic deliberate gait, his keen gaze resting briefly upon the now harmless contents of the retort before fixing upon his younger brother with that peculiar intensity they shared. "You have destroyed the specimens, I observe. Perhaps it is for the best, though the Crown was indeed interested in the potential military applications of the elder Finch's discoveries. The cost of securing them has proven unacceptably high." "So it was you," Holmes said, his voice cold with suppressed fury. "The letter we discovered at Inspector Grayson's residence was no fabrication. You did intervene in his investigation, using your authority to silence a conscientious officer who was merely performing his sworn duty." Mycroft lowered his considerable bulk onto a laboratory stool that protested audibly beneath his weight, his expression remaining imperturbable despite his brother's obvious anger. "I instructed Inspector Grayson to suspend his inquiries into the Carstairs shipment, yes. We had been monitoring Professor Finch's expedition for months before his death. When the crates arrived under false declarations, we wished to observe who might come forward to claim them. Grayson's official investigation threatened to alert foreign powers who were also seeking these particular botanical specimens." "And in doing so you isolated him," I interjected, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. "You stripped him of his official protection and left him vulnerable to a killer who believed Grayson represented the only obstacle to his secret's preservation." Mycroft regarded me with mild surprise, as though he had momentarily forgotten my presence. "I did not order his death, Dr. Watson. I merely prioritized the security of the Empire over the curiosity of a customs official, a calculation I am forced to perform on a daily basis. I could not have predicted that young Finch would be driven to such murderous extremes to protect knowledge we already possessed through other channels." Holmes laughed, a sharp and bitter sound that echoed strangely in the chemical-laden air. "The irony is almost beyond comprehension, Mycroft. Marcus Finch destroyed his soul and claimed 4 innocent lives to hide his father's work from a government that was already watching him, waiting for him to reveal the source of his specimens. He sacrificed everything to protect a secret that was never truly secret." Mycroft's expression grew somber as he produced a telegram from his waistcoat pocket, the yellow paper trembling slightly in his massive hands. "Speaking of young Finch, word has just reached me from Scotland Yard. Dr. Marcus Finch collapsed in his cell 30 minutes ago. The prison surgeon pronounced him dead of cardiac failure. The botanical toxin he absorbed through repeated exposure had completed its work long before you placed him in custody." A profound silence descended upon the laboratory, broken only by the gentle hiss of the gas jets and the distant sounds of London stirring toward dawn. The tragedy was complete in its terrible symmetry. The weeping killer was dead, his victims beyond earthly justice, and the deadly knowledge he had guarded now destroyed by the very man who had captured him. Yet Mycroft's presence served as a stark reminder that in the great game of nations, Individual lives, regardless of their brilliance or desperation, were often reduced to mere counters in calculations too vast for ordinary comprehension. Holmes turned off the Bunsen burner with deliberate care, the sudden silence ringing in our ears like a funeral bell. "Then the case is closed," he said, quietly, though his eyes remained fixed upon his brother with lingering resentment. "The poison is neutralized. The murderer is dead. And the government's precious secrets remain buried with their guardian. I trust you find this outcome satisfactory, brother?" "Satisfaction is a luxury reserved for minds less burdened with responsibility, Sherlock," Mycroft replied, rising with evident effort. "I am merely relieved that weapons of such devastating potential did not fall into hands less scrupulous than your own. Whether you choose to acknowledge it or not, you have performed a considerable service to the Crown tonight." As Mycroft departed, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the corridor beyond, I found myself studying my friend's profile in the dim laboratory light. His face bore the drawn expression of a man who had solved his puzzle only to discover that the solution revealed a world where the boundaries between criminal and patriot, between murderer and guardian, had been blurred beyond recognition. We had unravelled the mystery of the weeping murders, yes, but the victory felt hollow when measured against the human cost of the knowledge we had been forced to destroy. The fog outside had lifted considerably, revealing the first pale hints of dawn creeping across London's rooftops. Somewhere in the great city, people were beginning to stir toward another day, unaware that they had been saved from a threat they would never know existed. The weeping killer was no more, his tears finally dried, but the echoes of this case would linger in our memories long after the last traces of that deadly botanical extract had been neutralized in the flames of scientific necessity. Holmes gathered his coat with weary deliberation, his usual energy depleted by the night's revelations. "Come, Watson," he said softly. "Mrs. Hudson will have breakfast waiting, and I find myself in desperate need of something wholesome after breathing the poisoned air of governmental conspiracy. The game is ended, but I fear the victory belongs to no one, save perhaps the grave." The morning light filtered through our Baker Street windows with that peculiar clarity that follows London's most oppressive fogs, as though the great city itself were exhaling after holding its breath through the long night. Holmes sat wrapped in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, staring into the fireplace where Mrs. Hudson had kindled a cheerful blaze against the October chill. He had spoken barely a dozen words since our return from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, his mind clearly occupied with thoughts that ranged far beyond the immediate resolution of our case. The normalcy of the awakening city, milk carts rattling over cobblestones, street sweepers beginning their eternal labour, seemed jarring after our dark revelations. Inspector Lestrade arrived shortly after 9 o'clock, his face bearing the haggard expression of a man who had spent the entire night managing administrative aftermath. He accepted Mrs. Hudson's tea with visible gratitude, settling into the chair opposite Holmes with a weary sigh that spoke volumes about the burdens of official responsibility. "The Commissioner wishes me to convey his personal gratitude, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began formally. "4 murders solved, the perpetrator identified, his methods fully explained. The press will be satisfied," the public reassured, "a most satisfactory conclusion to a baffling affair." Holmes stirred slightly, his grey eyes fixing upon the inspector with uncomfortable intensity. "Is it indeed satisfactory, Lestrade? 4 innocent people are dead, killed by a man who believed himself protecting knowledge of immense value. The real architects of this tragedy, those who created the circumstances driving Marcus Finch to such desperate measures, remain comfortably insulated from consequence." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. Young Finch committed those murders of his own volition, sir. No one forced his hand. Did they not? Holmes rose abruptly, beginning that restless pacing I recognized as prelude to philosophical disquisition. Consider the sequence clearly, Inspector. Professor Finch spent 15 years researching botanical compounds, discovering substances of extraordinary potency. Colonial authorities moved to suppress his work, forcing illegal smuggling. Meanwhile, my brother's department monitored the operation for months, waiting to see who would claim the cargo. When Inspector Grayson's conscientiousness threatened premature exposure, Mycroft intervened to silence him, inadvertently marking him as target for the very killer whose existence the government failed to anticipate. I set down my teacup with sudden understanding. You're suggesting Marcus Finch was as much victim as murderer, caught between his father's legacy and forces beyond his comprehension. Precisely, Watson. A brilliant but emotionally unstable physician, burdened with knowledge he lacked wisdom to manage. He saw conspiracies where there were merely bureaucratic oversights, threats where there was only curiosity. Had governmental interest been openly acknowledged, legitimate channels might have preserved the research without resorting to murder. Instead, secrecy bred paranoia, and paranoia bred tragedy. Lestrade closed his notebook with finality. Be that as it may, Mr. Holmes, the official record will show Dr. Marcus Finch committed 4 murders using botanical toxin of his own manufacture, dying of self-inflicted poisoning before trial. The case is closed. After the inspector's departure, Holmes returned to brooding silence while I attempted organizing my notes into coherent narrative. The morning advanced toward noon, pale sunlight gradually strengthening as fog's last remnants burned away to reveal London in familiar, grimy splendor. I found myself thinking of Marcus Finch, that tragic figure whose tears had marked each victim, wondering what thoughts occupied his final moments in that prison cell. Holmes suddenly spoke, breaking extended silence with words emerging from deep contemplation. There is a moral to this affair, Watson, though it provides little comfort. Knowledge itself is neither good nor evil. It is merely knowledge, but the manner in which we acquire, protect, and apply it reveals the true measure of our humanity. Professor Finch discovered compounds that could revolutionize medicine or become weapons of unprecedented horror. His son chose murder rather than risk that knowledge falling into perceived wrong hands. My brother chose manipulation for strategic advantage, inadvertently creating conditions for tragedy, and we chose destruction rather than trust anyone with its applications. I considered carefully before responding. Yet surely destruction was necessary, Holmes. The risk was too great. Perhaps, he conceded with profound uncertainty, I rarely heard from him. Or perhaps we merely delayed the inevitable. Nature does not surrender her secrets permanently, Watson. Someone, somewhere, will eventually rediscover what Professor Finch found. The question is whether humanity will have matured sufficiently to handle such knowledge with appropriate wisdom. Holmes reached for his violin, that familiar refuge when the world's complexities grew too burdensome for rational analysis. As melancholy notes filled our sitting room, I returned to writing, determined to record the affair with all its moral ambiguities intact. The weeping killer was gone, his tears finally dried, but the questions his brief, tragic existence raised would linger like fog's last wisps clinging to London's ancient stones. Some cases, I reflected, are solved without ever being truly resolved, their implications echoing into futures we could only dimly perceive. This was certainly one of them.